Southwest Interfaith Team. It's a group of Jewish synagogues and temples, Christian churches, and Muslim mosques that come together every month throughout the year to hold various events. One of the events that we do is this public forum. We've been doing this since 2003, and we do about 2 to 3 forums a year. And we go to the various organizations every year. Sometimes it's at the mosque, sometimes it's at the synagogue or temple, and sometimes at the various church members. So welcome to you all. We also hold forum dinners. These are dinners we bring the 3 faiths together, and we, for lack of a better term, break bread. And you get to try various treats from different worlds. You get to try different conversations from different people. We have different topics. So there's a lot of information to my left here in the back about SWIFT, and I invite everybody throughout this program to gather over there, take a look at the various photographs that we've taken, the information about SWIFT. I invite everybody to log on to our newly developed website, swiftinterfaith.org or .com or .net. We've taken them all. There's also nice little cool pens or pencils in the back there. They are complimentary. You can please take one. So we do service projects. We'll go out to Habitat for Humanity and work together to help build homes. We'll go out to the food bank and help the needy. We're working now with Respond Now and pads. And when you walked into the register, you saw the boxes out there for Respond Now. And that's kind of our SWIFT project for this evening, is to help Respond Now, gather items for the needy, for the others that need help this year. So with that, I would like to introduce the Respond Now representative that is here with us today to kind of say a few words, and that's Sharon Go. Sharon?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of our director, Carl Wolf. He lives in Indiana, so he's not here today, and I live in Orland Park, so it was a lot easier for me to come than for Carl. But we do appreciate all your donations today. Respond Now serves the needy in the southwest suburbs. We're based in Chicago Heights. We have a satellite site where we give food once a week in Sauk Village, and we serve people in Chicago Heights, Ford Heights, Sauk Village, Park Forest, and other areas. The needy come to us very humbly, asking for food, help with their rent, utilities. We try to help them in any way we can if they have a genuine need. And we try to be good stewards of the money that's donated to us, because so much of our funds come from United Way, from donations from churches and groups. And we were actually founded by a group like you that saw a need in the community and wanted to respond. And that's how Respond Now was born. They saw the need and they started Respond Now, and it's grown over the years. It was founded in 1969. So the items you brought today as a donation are items that we rarely have to give our clients. Rarely do we have laundry detergent, bars of soap, extra deodorant. So whatever you brought today, please know that we appreciate it so much, and our clients will appreciate it too. And thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for all the hard work you do with Respond Now. We have a very exciting program for you today. 3 great speakers that are seated to my left here. And to set the rules and the tone for today's program, I'm going to invite my Christian co-chair, Jan Shawless.
Good afternoon. They don't make them for short people. My name is Jan Shawless, and I am the Christian co-chair for SWIFT. And I would personally like to thank you all for coming here today. It's great for me to see so many people here. I did want to discuss with you the policy of SWIFT, which at our events, we do not ever discuss politics. Politics is a subject that we don't even want to go near. We're here to build bridges. to build understanding, because it is through understanding that we learn to get along with our neighbors, and we learn so much about each other through our conversations. So there is a political ban here today. We're not going to go there, not our speakers and not our people in the seats. So I just wanted to bring that up front. Our three speakers today represent the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths. We will be having them speak on extremism and violence in the name of religion and how our scriptures deal with these topics. Professor Mark Swanson is a professor of Christian and Muslim Studies and Interfaith Relations at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. Rabbi Michael Balinsky is Executive Vice President of the Chicago Board of Rabbis and the Advisory Board member on the Bernardin Center of Catholic Theology Union. And Ahmed Rehab is the Executive Director of the Council of American Islamic Relations in Chicago and a board member of the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights. So each of them will be taking a turn speaking, and at the end we will have a question and answer period. Now, there will not be questions while they are speaking. If you do think of a question, raise your hand, and one of the SWIFT board members will come around and give you a pencil and paper. When you're done writing your question down, hold it up, and one of the representatives will pick that up from you. After the speakers are done, we will have a break for refreshments, and then after our break, we will have a question and answer period to where the questions will be read to the appropriate speaker, and then they will respond to your questions. So if we could have Professor Mark Swanson come up first. Thank you.
I will eventually get all my little bits and pieces arranged here. First of all, thank you very much. I want to thank the SWIFT, St. Michael's Parish, and all of you. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here and to be a part of this particular panel today. By the way, can everybody hear me? Is this working all right? Is it good? No. No. Is this better?
Yeah.
Are you picking me up?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to be careful, gentlemen. We'll have to be careful with the microphone here. What I would like to do is, it's not so much a talk as it is a series of just little points that I'd like to make that might be good as reflection starters. I do look forward to, well, hearing my fellow panelists and then to the discussion that we'll all have together. I'd like to start with some reflections on the word extremism that we're using. And it strikes me that the word itself is perhaps just a little bit problematic. I think we need this word. We need something with which to label the indiscriminate violence of some folks, for which one then finds religious or ideological justification. That is, indiscriminate violence that the perpetrator claims to be somehow pleasing to God. We regularly use this word, extremist, in this sense, and I think it's useful to have a word. It's useful to have a word that we understand and that we share. The problem with this, of course, is that going to extremes, if we put it that way, rather than talk about extremists or extremism, going to extremes is not necessarily a bad thing. We all admire the saints of our traditions who have gone to extremes in their love of God and love of the neighbor. And we praise God, who, we might say, has gone to extremes in creating, preserving, and guiding us. Christians praise the God who, I quote, so loved the world that he gave his only son. I think most Christians know that text from John 3:16. God goes to extremes. God so loved. God goes to extremes in God's love for humanity. And Christians strive to follow Jesus, who, Christians claim, I quote again, was in the form of God, but did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself A little bit later the passage goes, and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Another famous passage, Philippians chapter 2. For the New Testament, God goes to extremes, but of course not in violence, but in love. Now, more problematic for me than the word extremism is the word often taken to be its opposite, that is, moderation. We decry extremist members of our communities, but then often try to describe the central teachings of our communities as moderate. But is that really a good word? That is, at least for anything besides the weather. For the weather, it's a very good word. We like moderate temperatures and moderate rainfall. Those are good things. But I do not want to be moderate in my love for my wife or my children. And I certainly do not want to be moderate in my love of God. I aspire to be not moderate, but rather passionate and wholehearted in my faith. And besides, this is a problem that I see regularly. There are many journalists, many religious commentators out there who regularly use the word moderate as a kind of code. That is, code for people who really don't believe in much of anything. And so you hear about, moderate Christians. We like moderate Christians. Well, what do they mean by moderate Christians? They might mean people who don't go to church, who don't pray, who don't read the scriptures, and who really don't believe in any of that Christian stuff. We find the same thing with regard, very regularly, we find the same kind of thing with regard to moderate Muslims, where what the writer is really saying is that we like moderate Muslims. That means Muslims who don't believe in the teachings of Islam. So the word moderate is problematic. I would say let's leave moderate for the weather. But we can use extremist, but remembering that we're using this word in a particular way, in connection with indiscriminate violence and an attempt at a religious justification for that violence. Now, I've already quoted some New Testament passages. What I'd like to do, forgive me, I'm a seminary professor, and I'd like to read one of my favorite passages. This is from the 12th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. I'm starting at verse 9 and reading out of the Revised Standard Version. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly and sisterly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Never flag in zeal. Be aglow with the Spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in your hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink. For by doing so you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You can follow on from there to other passages. The New Testament is full of them. Just in the next chapter, in Romans chapter 13, we have St. Paul's words on the love commandment. The one who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this sentence, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And later on in the Epistle to the Galatians, I'm looking at Galatians chapter 5, we have a list of the fruits of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. A striking feature of all these passages from the Apostle Paul, with their emphasis on the love of neighbor and even the enemy, the renunciation of vengeance, their emphasis on patience, kindness, and gentleness, is that they come from someone who may provide us with the New Testament's fullest description of an extremist. That is, Saul of Tarsus, who later became the Apostle Paul. Now, many of you will remember the story as it is told in the book of Acts. Saul is introduced to us at the end of chapter 7. That's the story of the first Christian martyr, as Stephen the deacon was being put to death by stoning. Remember, Saul kept an eye on the cloaks of those who threw the stones, and the author states plainly that, I quote, Saul was consenting to his death. That's Acts chapter 8, verse 1. A chapter later, we are reintroduced to Saul, who was, we read, quote, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, end of quote, and who set out for Damascus to seek out and arrest any followers of Jesus that he found there. Now, you know that it was on that road to Damascus that Saul had an experience, an encounter with the risen Jesus, that changed him from persecutor of the church to that church's great missionary. Later, in the letter to the Galatians, Paul the missionary recalled his past, that he once, I quote, persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it, and that he did so as one who was so extremely zealous for what he called the traditions of my fathers. Here we have the portrait of someone we might call an extremist. He was breathing threats and murder, ready to use violence, consenting to, what shall we say, an extrajudicial execution. All this with the conviction that it was God-pleasing and that it somehow fit into God's plan. But then the New Testament tells the story of his conversion, so that Saul the extremist became Paul the apostle of Christ, who taught what? The love of neighbor and even the enemy, the renunciation of vengeance, and patience, kindness, forbearance, gentleness. In this Interfaith forum, I would like to go back to the passage from the 12th chapter of the letter to the Romans that I just read a minute ago, and lift out one section in particular. It reads like this: contribute to the needs of the saints, pursue hospitality, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. This is an interesting and I think extremely significant threefold command. In the first place, we have St. Paul's exhortation with regard to fellow members of the Christian community. St. Paul says, contribute to their needs. At the end, this is number 3, we have his exhortation with regard to those who are persecuting the Christian community. I quote, bless them, do not curse them. And then what of the middle? Here, in the middle of this sequence, what do we expect? We expect St. Paul's exhortation with regard to those who are not of the Christian community, but also who are not persecuting it. And here we read, pursue hospitality. The first word there is a strong one. It's not just practice hospitality, but pursue it. Actively seek out every opportunity for its exercise. Now, we could spend a lot of time. We could spend an entire lecture on this. I want to say that I think it points to a central New Testament theme which has direct application to interfaith relations. With respect for Christians, with respect to neighbors who are not Christians, St. Paul says, pursue hospitality. Pursue hospitality. And by the way, I think this is another occasion to thank Swift and to Father Paul and to the community of St. Michael's for your hospitality today. The center of the New Testament witness is the death and resurrection of Jesus. The death of one who did not oppose violence with violence, but, Christians believe, in his determination not to be compromised in his love, loved his sisters and brothers right to the end, and absorbed violence into himself in order to overcome it. That is the center of the plot of the New Testament narrative. And that is the witness to which those of us who are Christians are continually called to return, even as we realized just how often the church has abysmally failed at living out these central Christian teachings, these teachings of the love of God and the neighbor, even the love of the enemy and the renunciation of vengeance. This failure can be seen in a variety of places. Many of them have to do with ways in which the cross of Christ has been misinterpreted and badly lived out. Let me name a couple very briefly. First, very early on, many Christians decided that they needed to ascribe blame for the death of Christ. And for long centuries, the idea that the Jews were to blame for the death of the Son of God has been a blight on Christian teaching. Second, when Christianity became the favored and eventually official religion of the Roman Empire, the symbolism of the cross of Christ was radically transformed. Many of you will remember the story about Constantine before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which allowed him to enter Rome and to claim the imperial throne. You remember how he had a vision, it is written, of a heavenly cross, and heard the words "Teutonica," in this conquer. And with that, the sign of Christ's refusal to oppose violence with violence became a talisman of Roman imperial power and military victory. And we can follow this military symbolism of the cross all through Christian history, from Constantine and the Christian Roman Empire through the medieval Crusades, and right up to a hymn that I sang in Sunday school as a boy. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. I see some of you know it. How many of you sang that song? Okay. I can't sing it anymore. No. What an irony, though, if we think what happened through the course of Christian history to the symbol of the cross. And a third point, too briefly. Making sense of the cross was obviously a great challenge to Christian theologians, who sometimes have been tempted by explanations that pictured God the Father as requiring and even desiring Christ's violent death in order to show mercy to the world. With that, there's the possibility of reading violence right into the very heart of God. We can talk about that, but that too takes another lecture. I was asked by the organizers to say something about what the scriptures say about the concept of just war. Here I can be very brief. With respect to the New Testament, it doesn't discuss the concept of just war. Indeed, it's very hard to see how the passages that I read earlier can be brought to bear in a discussion of just war. Repay no one evil for evil, never avenge yourselves. But later Christian theologians, who lived in a world like ours, much given to warfare, participated in a common human search to try to find some ways to put limits on violence, and in particular, to find some ways in which the commandment to love the neighbor and simply the Ten Commandments might mean something in time of warfare. Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's lands and resources. That is not a just cause for warfare. Or, in the midst of warfare, commandments such as thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. Translate, thou shalt not rape and pillage. They do apply. They apply to non-combatants, and non-combatants have to be distinguished from the soldiers one is fighting. But this is, these are later developments. I think I'll quit here. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation later.
If I could have a couple of swift volunteers. I just prepared a sheet with the quotes I'm going to be doing. They're 75, so some of you may have to share. Okay, I'll give 1 to 2. It'll just help. while they're being handed out, I'll begin with a Lutheran Jewish joke of sorts. It's actually interesting. I'm not sure if there's Muslim Jewish jokes. I was just asking before, which is interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see in our culture how this type of humor develops and what that will say when we reach that point. But one Lutheran Jewish joke. I don't know how many of you had kids gone to school or been to university yourselves. They often had at the beginning of the year, particularly at state schools rather than private schools, you could get religious preference cards. I don't know if people ever got them when they were in college. They used to be handed out when I was doing campus work. And you'd get a religious preference card, and you could, if you chose to, unless you're taking pictures, I'll button my jacket. Start again. If you chose to sign the religious preference card, and then that would be given to whatever religious group existed on campus, and they could contact you. It was a way of, getting names and things like that. So a colleague told me this story. I don't know if it's true, but it's a cute story. That one of the students he knew, who was a Jewish student, had written Lutheran on his card. And he asked the student, well, why did you write Lutheran on the card? To which the student responded, the card didn't ask which religion I was, the card asked which religion I prefer. All right, the sheets are handed out, so I'll get to the talk. Which also begins with sort of an anecdote. I don't know if it's that funny. And it's also probably one that's not true, but it still indicates something. And also I thank Professor Swanson for giving me 5 extra minutes and yielding 5 of his minutes. That was a joke too. Anyway. The story is told of a Jew, we will call him Beryl, who at some point near the end of the 19th century went from his small town in the Ukraine with maybe 15 Jewish families in the town. And he went to visit Odessa, the big city on the Black Sea, where there was a community of thousands of Jews. When Beryl returned to his village, his friend asked him, how was his journey? And Beryl said it was wonderful. His friend then asked Beryl, well, did you meet any Jews there? And Beryl replied, oh yes, of course. And it was astounding. As soon as I got to Odessa, I met a Jew who was a communist. I met a Jew who was a capitalist. I met a Jew who was deeply observant and meticulous in his religious observance. And I met a Jew who was a free thinker. I met a Jew who spoke only Russian, and I met a Jew who spoke only Yiddish. I met a Jew who studied in the yeshiva, the traditional Jewish academy, day and night. And I met a Jew who had a PhD and taught at the university. Beryl's friend replied, Beryl, Odessa's a big city. Our town, we only have 15 Jewish families. But Odessa, what is so astounding about meeting so many different kinds of Jews? Beryl replied to his friend, you do not understand. What was so astounding was that all these kinds of Jews were the same person. I'm only describing the first Jew I met. Now, I begin with this story because if it was true of the Jews of Odessa, I think it's also true of ourselves within our religious communities. And to echo a little bit what Professor Swanson said, we are ourselves both passionate, and sometimes I'll use the word moderate for now. We have both within ourselves extremism towards certain ideals, and other ideals to which we shy away from. And as well, if we look at our traditions, I think we find both loving and embracing passages as well as extremist passages. I can look in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Jewish sacred scripture, and see love the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And I can look in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, for example, and find passages that say if your closest friend leads you into idolatry, you must take the lead in killing him. In truth, we cannot dismiss extremism from our traditions, and truth be told, as was just said also, it is a certain kind of passionate extremism that has allowed our traditions to survive. The critical question for us is how we navigate these sources of extremism which come from our sacred texts and how we address their impact. What we cannot do is excise them and pretend they are not there. Indeed, after 9/11, I worked on some educational material in my previous position I had. And I worked on some educational material for the Jewish community. I introduced it as follows. The horrible acts of September 11th have raised questions on how a religious tradition reads its sacred text that define the other and sanction violence against them. As many have begun to look at texts of violence in other communities, it becomes imperative for the Jewish community to begin investing its own sacred texts of violence. Strategies employed in reading texts that advocate violence to the other cut across religious lines. It is hoped that through this session, the material I had prepared, and perhaps today as well, participants will gain knowledge of how Jews have addressed these concerns and enable them to participate with a critical eye in interreligious discussion. So it's in this context that I want to look at some strategies that Jews have employed in reading sacred texts of violence and sacred texts that could contribute to extremism. We must first remember that in this context I'm dealing with sacred texts. Texts that are understood to carry with them divine sanction and authority. And as I mentioned, excision of these texts is not an option. Secondly, and this is very important certainly from a Jewish point of view, when we speak of sacred texts in Jewish tradition, this goes way beyond the Bible or Scripture. While Bible may be a foundational text, it is an act of heresy for a Jew to behave based exclusively on what does the Bible say that I should do. Rather, I make my decisions and read my sacred texts and scriptures through the lens of Jewish interpretive tradition, which for me is authoritative. I want to make sure you understand that point, all right? If I were to try to figure out, gee, what should I do? Let me open up the Bible, it'll tell me what to do. That for me is fundamentally an act of heresy. Now certainly what I'm going to do is based on the biblical text, but it's based on it as read through the lens of Jewish tradition and rabbinic tradition. So let's take one example of an extreme violent text and we'll see how it plays out. And here you can look at the first couple of texts on your sheets. This is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 25, based on a text in the book of Exodus. We have it there. So in Deuteronomy chapter 25, we have towards the end of the chapter, remember what Amalek did to you by the way when you came out of Egypt. How he, and Amalek here is a tribe, how he met you by the way and struck at your rear all who were feeble behind you, when you were faint and weary, and Amalek did not fear God. Therefore it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around in the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance to possess, then you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heavens. You shall not forget it. And blot out, you can understand what blot out means. Now this is based on the book of Exodus chapter 17. After the Jewish people had crossed the Red Sea and coming out of Egypt, it says simply in verse 8, and it's the next text you have, Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, pick men for us, go out, fight against Amalek. I'll go up on the hill tomorrow with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him to fight against Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur ascended to the top of the hill. Came to pass when Moses would raise his hand, Israel would prevail, and when he would lay down his hand, Amalek would prevail. Incidentally, in rabbinic tradition, reading this text, it asks the question, you mean to tell me Moses' hands changed the direction of the war? That's exactly the way the question's raised in Hebrew. You mean to tell me that? And the answer is no, of course not. But when Moses raised his hands, the people saw it and they dedicated themselves to the battle. And when Moses lowered his hands, they didn't dedicate themselves to God in the battle. So, okay. So then Joshua weakens Amalek. And then in verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, inscribe this as a memorial in the book, recite it to Joshua's ears, that I will surely obliterate the remembrance of Amalek from beneath the heavens. And Moses built an altar, named it God is my miracle, and he said, for there's a hand on the throne of the eternal, there is a war for the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation. Okay? Now, I think we'll all agree you could call this a sacred, violent text. Sacred because it's part of the Bible, violent because it seems to be advocating violence to Amalek on a permanent basis. Now, there are a number of questions, certainly, that we'll look at in terms of looking at this text, not the least of which is we'll get to who was Amalek and where are they, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, a few things I want to point out how this text was read. All right? One, it's understood, important in Jewish tradition, it's understood to be a commandment to remember Amalek and to destroy it. A commandment that is still considered by Jewish tradition to be a commandment, at least theoretically by the tradition. All right, so there's still this commandment. I fulfill and observe this commandment every year. We'll explain that in a few minutes. The potential for extremism here is clear. Wipe out Amalek. And yet what's striking in the tradition are a number of lenses that are used to understand this text. Number one, the tradition asks in a number of places, why should Amalek be destroyed? Now what's striking about that question is nobody gives the answer, Amalek should be destroyed because the Bible told you to destroy Amalek. Right? That answer is not given. In other words, there's an assumption is there must be something so radically immoral or evil about Amalek that they must be destroyed. But it's not enough simply to say the Bible says Amalek should be destroyed, destroy them. And don't question it. Rather the opposite. They go out of their way to say what is so evil about Amalek. And the Bible says they attack the feeble, they attack the weak from the rear. But there is that sense in which morality is not created by the Torah, the Bible, but it almost exists outside of it. And if something at first glance would appear to be immoral, then it must be justified. It cannot be justified simply by saying, because that's what the Bible commands. All right? Secondly, it should be pointed out that Amalek, unless anyone knows anyone who is an Amalek, no longer exists. All right? There are no more any Amalekites. So this commandment, although it's still a commandment, has no practical application. You cannot decide tomorrow someone is Amalekite and kill them. At the same time, remembering there is something as evil, I believe is important. And I should add, Jews today observe this commandment by being present when it is read from the Torah scroll. So how do I observe this commandment? I hear it read from the Torah scroll once a year, and that's it. And that's the extent of it. But at the same time, in hearing it, although I'm not attacking anyone, doing anything about it, in that sense, it does, I think, function on the level of remembering that evil is real. Okay, that's number two. Some interpret this commandment when dealing with it in a sort of psychological way, how it relates to the person. So some interpret it as, I must destroy Amalek, but I must destroy the Amalek within myself. I make it psychological. I must rid myself of how I can hurt and disregard others, particularly when they are in a vulnerable state. And I'll give you one example of this. It's text number 3 in the sheets. You can follow along. One 10-second word of background. Hebrew as a language. Hebrew letters also have numerical significance. All right, Hebrew numbers are the same as Hebrew letters. So you can sort of add up the numerical value of a word. And sometimes they're very clever. And this is an example of a very clever numerical addition of the word. All right? And if you don't understand it fully, don't worry about it. It's the point I want to draw from it. But that's what we're going to read about. This is one contemporary Reform rabbi wrote this, Jeffrey Salkin. And he says as follows, in writing about Amalek. He says, in gematria, which is when you add up the numerical value of the word through the Hebrew letters, Amalek has the same numerical value as the Hebrew word suffix, which means doubt. Reread Deuteronomy 25:17-18, substituting doubt for Amalek. Remember what doubt did to you after you left Egypt. How doubt surprised you on the march, or the Hebrew word can also mean cooled you off, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear when you were weak and tired. How doubt has no fear of God. Doubt encountered us and challenged us as we left Egypt. Doubt prevented us from attending to our task and the meaning of our trek. Doubt attacks those who straggle behind the community. Doubt may be an integral part of encountering God, but lasting doubt laughs in the very face of God. What must we now fear is not the external enemy, but our own internal paralysis. What are present-day Amalek? Doubt, fear, confusion, embarrassment. When we have felt we were struggling against overpowering odds, how can we overcome those things that's holding back from living a fuller Jewish life? How do we balance the need to remember our suffering and the need to rebuild the Jewish future? All right? But you get, I think, the sense of it here. Amalek is not something that's referring to a tribe that attacked you in the past. Amalek becomes a psychological category. How does one confront the Amalek within them? In this case, he talks about its comparison with doubt. All right, so that's another strategy in which completely the text is sort of, so to say, defanged. I mean, the violent element is taken, but still the sense of the text is preserved in this new interpretation. Okay. Another example of how tradition confronts this challenge of Amalek. Another way tradition is, 5 minutes? All right, I think I'll do it. But you held up the sign really well. I hope you haven't been holding it up for the past 10 minutes. Yeah. Another way, and I'm getting close, is I refuse to isolate the issue, but must read it in a larger context. This means that if I am commanded to destroy Amalek, I have to ask myself, how could I punish someone for who their parents or ancestors were? Does not the same Torah Bible which commands to destroy Amalek also say children shall not be punished for the sins of the parents? How can I destroy someone for whom their ancestors were? Thus, the response is that if you bump into an Amalekite, which again is impossible today, but if you bumped into one, you could even accept one as a potential convert if they have given up the evil ways of their parents. And you have the next text that's from one 19th century rabbi, it's number 4 on the sheet, explains, and he said as follows, it appears to me the descendants of Amalek, should they deserve to be punished, are punished not because of who their forebears were, but that they continue are punished because of the sins of their forebears. And at first blush, this is problematic. For it states in the Torah, parents shall not die on account of the father's sins, nor children for the sins of the fathers. All right, so what must it be? It must be known before God, if you bump into them and they still hate you, hate is rooted in their heart, if they continue to act in the way of their forefathers. However, if they have repented from their ways, they no longer continue in the path of their forefathers, and are no longer held responsible for the sin of their forefathers. So what's going on here? He's saying in this case, the text works against itself. I cannot isolate one text from another. Because I know on one hand, one text may say, destroy Amalek. On the other hand, another text says what? Love the stranger. I must love the stranger, but then I have to ask the question, what if the stranger is evil? And this is the true struggle of reading Scripture. And I really think it's the power of Scripture, which is to complicate matters and not simplify them. and that's what makes it sacred. The danger of extremism is to lose the complexity and to read Scripture in a simple way. Now, there's much more I could say about this, but I did want to point out just this one example of a molek and strategies Jews have used to understand it. And again, a molek as a real people do not exist, and Judaism has a system. This is one example of it that calls into question potentially extremist responses. And in the case of Amalek, confronts it head-on and limits it to a point that virtually abolishes the practical application of it, or makes it psychological, while at the same time recognizes that sometimes evil must be destroyed. So it's in this vein, it's no accident many Jews looked at the Nazis as the embodiment of Amalek, but never declared all Germans as a nation must be destroyed. Okay. I want to look at one other quick area as well and conclude with this. And I think there's another area as well, that Judaism and others as well must balance a messianic, sometimes apocalyptic reading of history with a sober reflection to reality. I have a messianic vision. I must allow it to give me something for which I dream, something for which I hope, but not allow it to distort or preclude the non-messianic, the sometimes messy world I live in and inhabit. To attempt to assert the messianic vision as actually already actualized is to beg and allow for extremism to rear its ugly head. And to conclude, I just want to read the second half of a poem by the Israeli poet Judah Amichai. It's number 5. It's a little prose part of a poem at the end. And he says as follows: "Once I sat on the steps by the gate at David's tower. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets? Just to the right of his head, there's an arch for the Roman period. Just to the right of his head. But he's moving. I said to myself, redemption will come only if their guide tells them. You see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there's a man who has bought fruit and vegetables for his family." Amichai reminds us here that the danger of extremism is to see only the glories of the past, to reimagine the glories of the past and to violently impose them on the present, and to lose sight of what is really the important piece, which is the man who has brought fruit and vegetables for his family. Any religious extremism that loses sight of the man and his fruit and vegetables is potentially very dangerous. Stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi. I want to remind you folks that if you do have any questions, raise your hand. Someone will put a paper and a pencil in it. You write down your question, and then they'll pick it up from you. If we don't have very many questions, we'll have an early evening. Next, we will hear from our Muslim speaker. His name is Ahmed, Rehab.
Tall people always suffer with microphones. I'm very delighted to be here with you today. I'm grateful for this invitation to be at this beautiful church that is clearly very active, judging from the parking lot, and that has its act together, judging by the beauty of the time cards in the back. I mean, that's beautifully designed and colored. I'm almost tempted to be flashed with the 5 minutes. Start counting down from the 12 minutes forward. They're beautiful. Love it. I'm very humbled to be on a panel of this stature. I myself am not an imam, unlike the two. I guess I'm the odd one out. I'm not. We have an ordained pastor, an ordained rabbi, and I'm not an imam. Sorry?
We're not imam.
You're not an imam. In that sense, I'm not the odd one out. However, by virtue of what I do as a civil rights activist working in the Council of American Islamic Relations, I find that much of my job is devoted to condemning acts of extremism and violence and working proactively against such acts and such beliefs and constructs, mostly those committed from within the Muslim community, but also those committed against Muslims. I'd like to begin by zeroing out, or sort of taking a larger picture, of a few constructs in Islam, a few principles in Islam. The reason I do this is because, and then I'll narrow down to a discussion of violence and extremism. The reason I do this is because I think that it's very difficult to try to understand a faith by or via an analysis of violence and extremism. Much like it would be difficult to understand the human body, the entirety of the human body, through an analysis of a cancerous growth. And so it's important for us to talk about the larger picture. What is Islam? What is its view of humanity, of life, of human relations? And then I can take a subsect of that and talk about violence and extremism. As Muslims, humanity comes first. The fact that we are humans. A Muslim is a way to live as a human. Islam itself is a term. It comes from the root verb in Arabic, and most root verbs in Arabic are either 3 letters, 4 letters, or 5 letters. Every other word comes as a conjugation, one way or another, of one of those root verbs. The root verb salama, 3 letters, sin, lam, mim, or SLM. It means to be in peace, to strive towards peace, to be peaceful and to spread peace. And so Islam is, for us, a religion of peace, a way of living a peaceful life. Now, it's a tertiary relationship. It's peace with the self, peace with God, peace with others. We're taught that in order to have peace with the self, that is inner peace, one must have peace with God first, the Creator, because that is the origin of humanity, and that is the destination of humanity. And we are here on earth for a time to come. Once we have that kind of peace, we're able to attain peace within ourselves, which then helps us attain peace with others. You'll find that many of the violent individuals or extremist individuals don't have inner peace. They're angry, they're bitter, they're vindictive. And so inner peace is very important to world peace. As a matter of fact, many of our imams teach that the greatest and most just wars of all is the war inside each of us. We often talk about wars between good and evil around the world and trying to figure out who's the good and who's the evil. But there is a war between good and evil inside each heart. And if each of us were to be victorious in that war, I guarantee a peaceful world. It all starts from within. Now, moving from the word Islam and what that means, and then to another very important construct, and that is iman, or belief. Now, iman as well comes from a root verb. In this case, it translates to secure or security. So to be a believer is to have inner security. As a Muslim, you have inner peace. As a believer, you have inner security. So both of these very important religious terms are very much paired with a sense of peace and security. When we talk about violence and extremism, and I do agree with Professor Mark Swanson that these terms need to be operationally defined. I think we understand what most of us are talking about. But just to say a couple of words about that. Extremism and moderation. If we were to accept, for the sake of the discussion, that we're talking about extremism that is bad, not the extreme in good or the extreme in the love of God, or etc., and then moderation meaning to be balanced in one's approach to things, not to go into the bad extreme, then let me state that a very important teaching in Islam by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, the Prophet of Islam, is that my nation, meaning the Muslim people, are a people of the middle way, a people of moderation. Meaning that in everything that we do not aspire to the extreme. In some cases, yes, even the good extreme, we're taught to avoid. Meaning, if prayer is good, I should pray 5 times a day. I can do extra voluntary prayers. But if I pray all day, every day, then that's considered bad. Because then I'm not working. I'm not a bread bringer. I'm not feeding my family. I'm not contributing to the economy or to society. I'm not doing other important acts of worship that I was instructed to do. So we are a people of moderation, a people of the balance. The balance is another very important construct in Islam that Allah or God speaks about, the mizan, which means to try to attain a balance in everything that you do, and the most important balance for this life is that of justice, the balance of justice. Going back to the general picture, God created human beings, again, our belief in Islam, and we were brought down from heaven to earth, same story as in the Bible, as delegates of God on earth, instructed to live a godly life, a righteous life, but given the absolute freedom to choose whether to do that or to do the absolute opposite or anything in between. And so the laissez-faire, or the let it be, or the libertarian approach is actually very Islamic. And it's mind-boggling to me to hear the religious interpretations that come out of extremist Muslims, particularly terrorists, about how they believe that it's in their own hand, and violently so, that they should force people to believe one way or another, to live one way or another. And it comes to as a shock or a surprise, at least, to many Americans or many in the West, to hear a Muslim identify and define Islam as a libertarian faith. But I'll quote for you some verses that will substantiate that, and the general, I think, belief of many of the imams is that in order for one to achieve the reward of faith, it has to be voluntary. If I am to do good work, it has to come from my heart, from my own desire. If I'm forced to do something that is good, would it even count? My heart is not in it. And so, for God, it has to be a choice. It has to be your choice. And for us as believers in God, we have to respect that and respect the freedoms of people, to believe or not to believe, to be Muslim or not to be Muslim, to live this way or to live that way. Pluralism is very much a part of the Islamic worldview. And so, while we are given this opportunity to make choices, and it has to be free choice for each and every one of us, and as we engage in these internal battles, at the end, when the time comes, and the time will come for each and every one of us, none of us will be here forever, and we pass on to the next world, we will reconvene, meet again with our Creator, and then be brought to answer for our choices. God is the ultimate judge, not human beings. God judges people. Now, it also says in the Quran, "Man sha'a minkum falyu'min man sha'a minkum falyukfir," which means those of you, humans, who wish to believe, then believe. And those who wish to not believe, let it be so. It's a choice. The Quran 25:63 says, "The worshippers of the All-Merciful, of Allah, are those who tread gently upon the earth. And when the ignorant address them, they reply, peace. Peace be upon you." So this is a higher level of nonviolence and non-extremism, that even when you're taunted, and this verse was brought down to the early Muslims when they were facing persecution and taunts from others. Even when you're taunted, even when you're provoked, the civilized way to behave, the Muslim way to behave, according to our teaching, is to not engage such vain talk, and instead to respond, peace be with you. Go in peace. Another verse in the Quran along those same lines, 28:55, when they hear, talking about Muslims, when they hear vain talk, they turn away from it and say, "To us be our deeds, and to you be yours. Peace be to you. We do not seek out ignorance." So again, it's take the higher ground in a confrontation. Now this deals with non-violent confrontation, when it's a taunt or provocative rhetoric, etc., which many times leads to violence. But when there is aggression from the other side, when the other side instigates and initiates the aggression, it's important for me to concede here, if that is to be a concession, that Islam is not a pacifist religion. It does not teach pacifism. It teaches peace, but it recognizes the right of a human being to self-defense. But for it to be self-defense, and now we get into jihad and what that means, and what it doesn't mean, because it's one of those concepts that's very critical to this discussion, and very much misunderstood, I think, in the general population, including within many Muslim communities. It's important to understand that jihad itself, as a term, means struggle, an inner struggle, first and foremost, but a struggle towards justice. To struggle towards justice. The greatest jihad our Prophet teaches us is the jihad of the self, meaning to struggle against the evil of the self. Now, there is, of course, the lesser jihad, and that is to struggle against an external evil. But for it to be jihad, it has to be with certain rules and regulations of the Quran and the Sunnah, or the way of the Prophet, make very clear that it should not be in aggression. It should not be for personal gain. It should be simply to end an evil, to put a stop to a physical threat. And once that's been achieved, then to immediately fall back in line of peace and seeking peace. So even that type of physical response is, in the end, towards achieving peace. When all and every opportunity towards achieving peace has been expired, and no other opportunity or chance remains, and a greater damage or a greater loss will happen to the common good or to humanity or to the self, then and only then can one reluctantly, even then, engage in that type of self-defense that we call jihad. But under no circumstances should it be an act of aggression, and under no circumstance is the other, whether it's Jews or Christians or even disbelievers, fair game for attacks or for being harmed in any way by a Muslim. That is the primary reason why we, as Muslim spokespersons, stand up and condemn terrorism. Not just, we're not looking to please American audiences or Western audiences, but because it flies against the very nature and the very teachings of our own faith, that it offends it as such. Of course, the loss of human life, the spilling of blood offends any decent human being, and that is the main reason why we respond. But above and beyond that, it's the fact that such individuals are severely misrepresenting our faith and perhaps, influencing other young people to believe that what they're doing is right. And so we have to come out and speak out. And we're told sometimes that we don't do it enough. But, you got to do what you can and hope that people hear. Often when I'm faced with the media, they say, where are the modern Muslims? You don't condemn this, you don't condemn that. I ask them, where do you expect me to condemn it? Do you expect a fax to your house or an email to your own personal email address? Go to my website. That's where I have control over what I say. And of course, we send press releases to each and every media outlet that we can. But at the end of the day, it takes one to speak and the other to hear. It takes two to tango when it comes to understanding and coexistence and cohabitation. Now, within Islam, and again, it's completely, it flies against what you will hear from extremists or individuals or communities like Al-Qaeda. But Islam recognizes Judaism and Christianity as a religion of God, as a faith of God. I think they're messing with my microphone right now. As a matter of fact, the Quran states in verse 569, surely the Jews, Christians, Sabians, those who believe in God on the last day and do righteous work, their rewards is with their Creator, and no fear shall be on them, neither shall they sorrow. So that's a statement of acceptance, and acceptance goes beyond tolerance, or mere tolerance. Likewise, without getting into much detail or, of a bureaucratic nature, but we as Muslims, the kosher food is considered halal food for us. We can eat kosher. So there's a lot of commonalities, and there's a sense of this is a religion that is accepted or to be respected. Likewise with Christianity. As a matter of fact, a verse in the Quran, 582, you will find the nearest in love to the believers, to Muslims, are those who say, we are Christians. That is because amongst them are priests and monks, and they are not proud. So it's very difficult for me to understand how an extremist or a violent Muslim can engage in attacking the so-called infidels, being Christians or Jews, when you have verses like this in the Quran. Of course, I understand the complexity of what interpretive or interpretations of texts can do. And I agree with Rabbi Balinsky that interpretation is a very important aspect of understanding faith, and different people can interpret different things differently. Of course, there are verses in the Quran that can be misinterpreted towards violence. And there are also verses in the Old Testament and the New Testament that can achieve the same unwanted or undesired effect or result. And indeed in the Muslim case it has, and likewise in the case of Jews and Christians historically as well. Perhaps we're living in a time in which those Muslims who misinterpret the texts pose a greater danger to those of us living in the West. And there are historical and political reasons for that. We were told not to get into politics. It's very difficult not to get into politics when you're discussing these things. I won't get into that. We're close to running out of time. Anyway, but suffice to say that in many cases, while these individuals and these organizations are quick to justify their acts through the religion, an analysis by scholars and pollsters and other forms of intellectuals, it seems to agree that for the most part the motivation is political. The motivation is political in one way or another. And that in order to attain a certain level of legitimacy or respect or acceptance in a community that is for the most degree religious, or at least respects religion, religious justification comes about. There are those amongst them who sincerely believe that is what the religion teaches. While they're in the minority, the damage that they do affects the majority greatly. And so it is a struggle for Muslims that we are dealing with today, and that is playing out as we speak. If we can look further into the Quran, and we talk about the issue of a just war, exempt those with whom you have concluded a peace treaty, with those with whom you're in peace, and those who come to you with hearts unwilling to fight you. Do not fight them. Had God willed, he could have placed them in power over you, and they would have made war on you. Therefore, if they leave you alone, refrain from fighting them and offer them peace. God does not want you to go against those who are in peace. A verse in the Quran. So once again, the Quran consistently talks about do not be the aggressor, do not initiate aggression against anyone for any reason. The best way is the way of persuasion. The best way is the way of communication, of dialogue. When you are under threat, when all alternatives have been exhausted and there's no other option while under physical threat, one then can reluctantly engage in self-defense, in jihad, but even then there are stringent rules and regulations. For example, in the early days when the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, were to engage in battle after the early Muslims were evicted from their homes and their goods and property confiscated and they faced physical persecution, during the heat of battle he would begin the battle with cries of do not uproot a tree, do not strike against an unarmed man, do not strike against the elderly or children or women. And these rules and regulations are not there for sugarcoating or window dressing. It goes back to the very basic belief of Islam and Muslims that I spoke about earlier, which is the sanctity of the human being and the reluctance of engaging in even self-defense such as this, but that it is for ultimately bringing back a sense of peace and harmony amongst people. I would like to conclude with a couple of remarks, and that is, we live in a nation that I think is one of the greatest experiments, socially and politically, that the world has ever seen. Suffice to say that in other places where people are just a little bit different, if you're just a little darker, or a little less Muslim, you're both Muslim, but one is Sunni and one is Shia. You're both Christian, but one is Protestant, one is Catholic. We've seen not only misunderstanding, we've seen not only non-coexistence, but we've seen bloodshed. Here we live in a country in which people come from different continents, let alone different countries. Different religions altogether, let alone different sects within a religion. And for the greatest and most part, we remain the people who live in peace and harmony. I think that is credit to this nation and to the people, the American people who live and work to make this nation what it is. But let us be also very careful that our future depends on what we do in the present. And we can never for a second believe that the way it's been is the way it always was. That while we face today a sense of this fear-mongering that is placed against one community or another, this radicalization on both sides, and it's not just radicalization of Muslims, but also radicalization on the far right or the far left. And as we hear the rhetoric grow in terms of the hate-mongering. It is up to each and every one of us to play a role in bringing peace now, so that peace can prevail later. When we are talking about a clash of civilizations, an unsubstantiated theory that strikes fear in the hearts of many Americans and many in the West, that we are facing a global war between religions, soon to come. It is up to the rest of us who understand our spiritual scriptures and our texts and the real underlying soul and spirit of what it means to be righteous and godly, to remind people that there is not a clash of civilizations, but a harmony of good, a harmony of civilization. The reason why I say this is because any clash that has happened or will happen is usually a clash between extremists of both traditions or both sides. And that harmony is left to be at the hands of those who are, for lack of better terms, on the moderate side or in the mainstream side of whichever side. So it isn't Muslims versus Christians, as I often say in the media. It's extremists in the West versus extremists in the Middle East that are having this so-called clash. And that those of us who believe in humanity, in peace, in harmony, in coexistence, whether you're on this side of the fence or that, you're on one side. And to me, that is the hope that we have moving forward. I do believe that it's also important to differentiate between the misapplication of a spiritual text by members of a particular community and the authentic sources of that text. And also to understand the scholarly, mainstream, endorsed interpretations of that text versus the marginal, sort of underground misinterpretations. I conclude with that, and I thank you very much.
I want to thank all three of our speakers. Now, we will be breaking for a few minutes for some refreshments, but before we do, I want you all to think of some question you have. We have received in quite a few. If you do think of some, put your hand up, go see either Jim or Joel, and Jim and Joel, put your hands up, see them during the break, and you can write down your question. And it's even okay to ask Mark a question. Maybe you answered all their questions, I don't know. But it's okay. I know we're in a Christian building here, and we may not want to upset the Christians, but you can ask Mark a question. It's okay, guys. All right, refreshments in the back, coffee, and liquid refreshments, cookies over here.
We have a little quirky mic here. I'm Betty Murray. I'm a member of the parish of St. Michael's, and on behalf of all of the people who are here today, I'd like to welcome you myself. I'm on the board of SWIFT. I've been on the board of SWIFT for, I'd say maybe 5 or 6 years now. I lost count. And I'm going to offer you the opportunity today to hear the questions that came from the audience and ask them of the specific people, or in some cases of all three. And that's what we'll do. We'll start out with one that's for all three. This is the question. Is extremism / moderation a latter-day construct? Has it been imposed ex post facto as a means of control and compliance? Or does it have any legitimacy in the historic traditions and texts? It's for all three of you, so whoever would like to begin the answer, go right ahead.
Yes. I guess you all heard that. I think that I'll relate it specifically and raise it in a Jewish context specifically. It really has its application specifically in the context of the Hebrew Bible in a story that's in the book of Numbers, the 4th book of the Bible, where you had, I don't remember all the characters' names, but you had a Midianite woman with an Israelite man or vice versa, essentially engaging in a sexual relationship in the midst of the camp. Pinchas, who is one of the priests, God gets very angry, of course, at all of this. That plagues begin to happen. Pinchas, who's one from the priestly class, takes a spear and rams it through the couple as they're sexually engaged together. And while they do not live happily ever after by any means, the Pinchas receives the covenant of peace. Now, it's actually a fascinating story because it creates, it's clearly an act of zealotry. And then within rabbinic tradition, there is tremendous discussion about, hold it, he had no legal right to do that. What does it mean to act as a zealot when you're violating what they understand is violating the law? Because this was outside of the judiciary, suddenly he's doing this action which really requires a judicial response to it. So that creates a whole sense of dialogue among the texts as to, is zealotry ever permitted? What does it mean that Pinchas is granted the covenant of peace? Specifically, Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace, when the act he had done was a tremendous act of violence. It's interesting that when that section is read from the biblical scroll from the Torah during the year, it's part of the yearly cycle of readings from the 5 books of Moses, which happens every Saturday, every Shabbat. The prophetic reading attached to it is the story of Elijah the prophet. And it's the story of Elijah the prophet after it describes that he has a battle with the prophets of Baal, the priests of Baal, the prophets of Baal. And it's a great biblical story, which of course, since it's the Bible, Elijah ends up winning. What the Baal story has, I don't know, but in the biblical story, Elijah ends up winning, and it's a contest to prove whose God is the real God. So they build an altar, and it is whoever God sends down fire on the altar is the real God. So the Baal people try, and it doesn't work. Elijah pours gallons of water on his altar, and then, of course, a fire comes down from heaven, and he wins. Now, what happens after that story is that Elijah runs away, and he goes to the mountain, maybe the very mountain of Sinai, of Revelation, and he runs away to that mountain, and God asks him, like, what are you doing here? That's the Hebrew. And Elijah says, I have been a zealot on behalf of you, God, because all the people have turned away from you. Even though they saw this great miracle, all the people have turned away from you. God, asked again Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah said, well, I've been a zealot for you, God. All the people have turned away from you. And God responds to him in that text, in the book of Kings. Well, first of all, they haven't all turned away from me. And number two, it's now time for you to give up your prophecy and your role as the prophet, because you are so zealous on behalf of God that you have lost sight of the people. And then he's told, now go and place your mantle upon Elisha, who becomes the next prophet. Now, it's a very telling story, and it's that issue of zealotry on behalf of God becoming very problematic legally, certainly taking the law into your own hands like that in an extrajudiciary fashion. And number two, when you're zealous on behalf of God, certainly from the Elijah story, you lose sight of the reality of the people. And what becomes much more the favored rabbinic model is those who are zealous on behalf of the people and willing to let God worry about God. And it's the role of the leader then, and it's amazing what the rabbis do with biblical stories and the like. It becomes the role of the leader to defend the people against God and not to act for God against the people. So that's why I answered yes.
Oh, you want $5?
Thank you for the question. That's a very interesting one. Since I spent so much time talking about extremism and moderation, I had better say something in response. This is a real possibility, of course, that we come up with these terms and then use the terms where one term basically means this is what we approve of and the other term means this is what we don't approve of. And we can use those as a kind of means of control, which I think is why it's important constantly to be talking about what do we mean by these terms and defining these terms. And that's what I just heard Rabbi Balinsky doing. What does it mean to be zealous? And zealous for the Lord, zealous for the people. You have this ongoing conversation about what does it mean to have zeal. We can do this with extremism. And one of the things I tried to do in my talk was to define that rather carefully. We have a little bit of we could have a conversation on the moderation term. What Mr. Rehab was doing was saying, well, we can use the word moderation, but remember then that we're talking about balance and responsibility and things like that. That's great, I don't have any quarrel with that. What I do want to do is question the times when people use the word moderation, where they're really talking about half-heartedness, insincerity, or just being merely nominal in one's religious belief. So every time we see these terms, we have to ask, we have to figure out what is being meant. I mean, as Mr. Ahmed was using the term moderation, there's no contradiction between that kind of moderation and the wholehearted sincerity that I think is a virtue of all our traditions.
I think that extremism and moderation are human constructs, first and foremost. Meaning that whether you tend to be someone who is, again, defining extremism as being overzealous or irresponsible or mischievous in any way, or whether you're someone who's balanced for the good and the common good and compassion, etc., that tends to be a human paradigm, not something that comes out of text or out of a paper. I think all faiths, and I speak for the Abrahamic faiths as a Muslim, I believe that all three of them were God-sent. The messages that came upon the Prophet Muhammad, and for us, as we call him, the Prophet Jesus and Prophet Moses, I think that the cornerstone of each and every one of these faiths was compassion. And that if someone were to engage in a non-compassionate life, then they're not following that faith. But we can talk about extremist followers, and you'll find them in every faith, or moderate, compassionate followers, and you'll find them in every faith. And for the most part, it's a dimension or a factor of the human personality, and not something that can be poured on the faith or even on a larger group of people. You can't say there's an extremist race or an extremist gender or an extremist nation. These things are not to be defined on groups of people, but rather on individuals, even if those individuals can come together to compose a group or an organization, such as Al-Qaeda. They say it's an extremist organization, but it's because its members engage in extremist behavior and ideologies.
There's another question from Mr. Rehab. You said jihad is a response to a physical threat. What about an ideological threat? Is that a threat to the individual or to the faith?
Can you repeat that last one?
Sure. What about the ideological threat? Is that a threat to the individual or to the faith?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, an ideological threat comes from misinterpretation. That someone has engaged in a perverse interpretation of the text, the only text that we have, the Quran, and therefore created, as a result of it, a spin-off, perverse ideology. That ideology becomes a threat to that faith community, no doubt. because it threatens to disrupt the original meanings and the practice and application of that faith. We depend on the knowledgeable, trained scholars of good character to interpret the text for the mainstream. And we question those who don't have the credentials or those who are not showing us scholarly rigor. And in Islam, we don't have such a construct as the church, meaning a specific organization that has the mandate to define and interpret the text for the people. We don't have a pope. We don't have a hierarchy. You know, it's a flat populist religion where any member of that faith can interpret and engage in scholarly work. But of course, naturally speaking, organically speaking, schools will be created, movements will be created in which there will be a measurement or an assessment of one's scientific methodology and one's scholarly approach to that text. Therefore, we have such schools and we have such imams that graduate from those schools. You'll find that most, if not every, mainstream accepted organization or school or imam in the Muslim world speaking against extremism and violence and suicide bombings and murder and those type of things. You'll find that many of those who support violence against innocents are those who are on the periphery, on the marginal, underground of the greater Muslim community. Of course, by the nature of their deeds, they get to be heard more of. They get to come on CNN more than the rest of us. Into your living rooms, you get to hear from them, and therefore they get a larger say that's disproportionate to their worth and value in our community. They get a larger say to the Western public as it so stands in the last, decade or more. But that's something that I think is changing as we speak. So an ideology, a perverse ideology, is a threat to the faith community.
This is a question for Rabbi Balinsky. Why does Scripture is complicated? What is God trying to do with us by complicating Scripture?
Helps me pay the bills. Who asked that? I think it depends on the nature of how one understands it. It's an important question. It depends on the nature of how one understands the possibility of divine word, divine command, divine language. For Jewish tradition, that meant two things, of course, which are mutually contradictory. One is Ein Hamikra Yotzei El Midei Pshuto, that verses should really be understood in their contextual, plain, perhaps meaning. And number two, Shivim Panim LaTorah. There are 70, and 70 means multiple, as it's a number for multiplicity. 70 nations traditionally. So there are 70 faces to each word, each verse of the Torah, which means 70 possible interpretations. Now, that's a little bit tension exists with each other, but I think that's the nature of seeing Scripture, and particularly the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, although not exclusively that by any means, as seeing it as filled with meanings, and therefore not allowing, therefore the result is for Jewish tradition, not allowing for simplicity. And I think that's the nature of the biblical text. It's the nature of the biblical text that was not discovered by any means by biblical critics. It's the nature of the biblical text itself that it's filled with contradictions. And if you begin at the beginning and read Genesis chapter 1, for example, about creation of the world and human beings, and then you read Genesis chapter 2, for example, about the creation of the world and human beings, you're reading two different stories that I would argue fundamentally cannot be reconciled. That is the nature of the divine text. Or I would like to read it as that. That is the nature of the divine text that is aware of the complexity of human beings, the complexity of the world, as well as on some level the complexity of God. And so it can't be simple. Indeed, there are Jewish rabbinic midrashic traditions that picture when the world is to be created, the attribute of justice, saying, let the world be created exclusively through justice. The attribute of mercy comes and says, if it's only through justice people end up killing each other, let it be created through the attribute of mercy. Peace comes and said, let it be created through the attribute of peace. Truth comes and said, let it be created through the attribute of truth. Now, in one particular text, truth is cast into the ground, because you can't really have a world complete with just truth. It's complex, and even to the point, and this is another 2-hour talk, but I'll just give it to tantalize you so you'll invite me back. Justice was understood by Jewish tradition beyond the biblical text, but within rabbinic tradition, even justice was understood in its application to the world as being as well as to God, as being fundamentally unjust. And that justice means something beyond what we normally might associate justice to be. So that's the way Jewish tradition has read the biblical text, and therefore would argue very much against someone, or as I like to say, I'll put it this way, if you ask someone about what do Jews believe about, pick whatever topic you want, and you only get one answer, they're either don't know anything or they're lying.
All right, the next question is for everyone. How can we recruit more adults to speak out in schools, churches, synagogues, and how can we get them encouraged to do this?
Speak out about anything in particular?
It doesn't say any particular thing, but I would imagine. To speak out. Who wrote the question? Do you recognize it?
Now no one's willing to admit it.
Okay. Let's focus and give it a arbitrary, perhaps, definition of being charitable towards all people.
Thinking about this question, one of the things that I'm grateful for, especially over the past 10 years, is the number of people who have been recruited in order to speak out on behalf of interfaith harmony, on compassion for all people, in just a wide variety of settings. There weren't so many people who felt comfortable doing this kind of thing 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Certainly my experience 10 years ago, I had a class of new students studying Islam and Christian-Muslim relations. And after 9/11 happened, very, very quickly, in fact, within a month, they were all going out to congregations and giving talks to Christian congregations about Christian-Muslim relations. Well, boy, did they get trained in a big fat hurry. But this was multiplied, I think, throughout all of our communities. Certainly, there were many Muslim communities who trained Muslim young people to go and visit schools and to give introductions to Islam. Who are Muslims? How do they pray? These kinds of things. So this is something that has happened. Obviously, one needs to seek out, those who are interested in hosting such people, and it does take some training and some getting comfortable, but I'm for the most part simply grateful that so many people have embraced this work.
I don't have much to add to that because I think that really accurately describes it. Except to say when I began my first job, which was when I was 25, just finished rabbinical school, and was at the University of Michigan working with Hillel, the Jewish Student Foundation there, and working with students. I said when issues became people, it got a lot more complicated. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. It's how we encounter the other, and the other then just doesn't become the other, but it becomes someone with whom we engage, and also can begin to really ask difficult questions and probing questions of each other in a way that's done out of a sense of trust at the same time. And that's, I think that by and large has happened with the Jewish and the Christian communities. And we've been together longer in this country, so it's somewhat ahead of what's happening with the Jewish and the Muslim community. But it really is, I think, beginning to happen in important ways. You know, at the first stage is everyone's polite. You know, well, I don't want to offend you and stuff like that, which is for the best of motives. But you have to get beyond that point where you build a relationship of trust, where you're willing, through the act of questioning, not declarative statements, but willing to take the risk of, through the act of questioning, and almost not worry about offending if it's asked as an open-ended question, and you're willing to listen to the response.
I believe that dialogue shatters the myths that silence creates. So I appreciate the spirit of the question, that more dialogue is needed. However, we need to be careful of what dialogue means. Dialogue means that we don't talk over each other or at each other, but to each other. And that's what's needed more of, you know, quality dialogue, and not just the frequency of dialogue. And we also have a responsibility as listeners, so to speak, or the audiences, to reach out. I mean, the reason why we're all here is because we're invited. So basically, if you want to hear more interfaith, invite more people of other faiths. And I say the same to Muslim audiences, hopefully, you know, Christian audiences believe, I mean, Jewish and Christian audiences believe the same thing. It's a question of us reaching out to hear from others. Growing up in this country 20 years ago when I first came here, watching television, watching a show in which a Muslim issue is being tackled sometimes meant watching an anti-Muslim debate someone who is really anti-Muslim. And these were the two sides of the story. Muslims were not part of the conversation. In recent years, with my generation coming of age and getting into the professional media work, we began to add our voices to the equation. I think that's helped a lot. We haven't done enough of it. The threshold of overcoming the otherization has not been fully met, but we're going in the right direction. Our interfaith partners. Oftentimes when we're attacked as a community, we look to our Christian, Jewish allies and friends to be with us. You know, just as racism was not defeated by, or slavery, or any of those things that, you know, were an epidemic in this country against the African-American community, by African-American leaders alone, you know, they'll be the first to tell you that without whites standing with them, they would not have overcome this tragedy. Likewise, for any, you know, group that is facing discrimination or misunderstanding, for us as Muslims, we need the other faith communities to speak out as well. And we would do the same for others, and that's the way we work. That's the dialogue I'm talking about.
There's a question for you. How do terrorists justify their behavior when the Quran calls for peace?
I imagine they would justify it by interpreting the texts that allude to war in a way that meets their purposes of being instigators of war and violence. And they create a vision of a world that is forever in conflict, that there are inherent differences between us and the otherized. In this case, for them, it would be Christians, Jews, infidels, as they call them, or people who are disbelievers, etc. And that it is their religious duty to meet to the will of God by overcoming those communities. To me, again, that goes fundamentally against the true teachings and beliefs of a Muslim. And my consolation is that they remain a minute minority. My concern is that they're effective and they're violent, and the effects of their evil work is great. One needs only to point to the 9/11 attacks as an example. But at the end of the day, the good news, as we sit today here, is that they're dwindling off, both in their organizational capacity, definitely in their ideological capacities. Again, suffice to point to the Arab Spring as an example of how different a world we're living in right now. And I had the privilege of being part of that, having arrived in Egypt 2 days before the revolution broke out and remained in Cairo, originally Egyptian, until the president, Mubarak, former president, had left. And then to see how this was a non-religious revolution, non-sectarian revolution. See Christians and Muslims marching in the streets together, calling for common human values of respect for humanity, non-violence by the police, anti-corruption, basic human rights and civil rights for all. That is what we're seeing a lot of Muslims of the coming generations, in the young generations right now, aspiring towards, and not this perverse ideological confrontation between faiths.
Thank you. Here's an interesting question. All three, this is for all three of you, as an opposition to violent extremism, could three faiths of Abraham come together to worship, in quotes, our God? Together, could we bring the best of each to honor and praise together? Your thoughts?
No. No, it's actually interesting. And the Jewish Catholic Scholars Dialogue is a small group that's been meeting for a number of years. It started in the days of like Cardinal Bernardin. It's just about 20 of us. But that was the topic for this past Monday's meeting. Actually, with Sister Christine Athens spoke in favor of it, and I actually spoke against it. I think there is, within the midst of our openness to each other, to see each other, as the other on some level would want to be seen, which is what we're talking about, that does not involve for me a blurring of distinctions, but an acknowledgement of religious distinctions, not making value judgments on those religious distinctions, but acknowledging that they are there and they are profound, that on some level we share some common language. On the other hand, we do not share some common language. My relationship with God in the context of prayer is, I believe, in many ways different than an aspect of a Muslim conception and a Christian conception of what's going on. That, again, is not a value judgment. It's a recognition of distinct practice. And there is a certain intimacy in the act of prayer, as well as the definition of community within the context of prayer, in which it precludes me from being an active advocate of it. I see that in the same way I recognize that I engage with lots of people, but I have a certain intimate relationship with my wife. I engage with God with lots of people, but I have a certain intimate way of worship of myself and my community that, to be authentic to that community, precludes worship with other community. That's number one. Number two, and here I'll be a little bit overstated, and I recognize that, but what the heck. I've said it before in another context. Sometimes I think the desire to pray together is an act of Christian imperialism that's being put on other faith communities who do not see prayer functioning in that way, or feel the need or the desire to have people to be in the situation that they're able to pray together, and that prayer is not necessarily the highest religious act. Okay, now I say that fondly. I want to be very clear. I know I stated with some hyperbole. But for what it's worth, working now now at the Chicago Board of Rabbis for my 4th year, and having been a president of the organization years ago, and having gone to many rabbinical meetings of all shapes, sizes, and stripes, we have never begun one with a prayer. We pray in the morning, but we don't begin meetings like that.
I think several of us have experience of quite a few experiments at interfaith events of a variety of kinds, including interfaith prayer over the past many years. And some of them basically were failures. Not failures in that things went wrong and people left angry, but failures in the sense that the organizers tried to find a kind of language that was acceptable to everybody in the room. And you ended up, what can you say? Maybe a few cliches, but not a whole lot more than a few cliches. What worked somewhat better was the kind of event where people came and actually brought something out of their tradition. A scripture reading, a song, a hymn, a prayer that came deep from the tradition, some kind of a reading. So there was a sharing, and people were hearing things that they were unaccustomed to. What it seems to me works even better is a kind of interfaith hospitality, where we go and visit one another's services. We can make space for people to come and actually see what happens. What happens as Muslims pray, what happens as Jews pray, what happens as Christians pray, and give people a taste of what's going on in our different communities. That's where some real learning takes place.
Was the verb used in the question pray or worship? I'm hearing guesses from the audience.
To worship, quote, together.
Worship. So then my answer would be yes. Because for a Muslim, prayer is one form of worship, but not the only form of worship. Anything that a human being does, if they do it in righteousness, for the right reasons, in the way of God, can be deemed worship. For example, work. If I'm a construction worker, if I'm working with dignity and honesty and performing my job to help society and bring food to my children, that's a form of worship that I get rewards from God for, just as I would for prayer. Charitable work, communal work, talking to someone. If I talk to you with respect, and again, respect your humanity and dignity, that right there, just a conversation, is a form of worship for me. And so, absolutely, we can worship together. And more precisely, through projects of common good. For example, a charitable project, something like Peace Corps, in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims, it's a common organization for all three, where they all practice their traditions of charity together, going to Africa or Asia or whatever else, and doing that together, I think would be a wonderful idea. When I was in Turkey, go there a lot, I've been there 14 times. The first time I went there and visited the Hagia Sophia, I sort of had this vision or fantasy. As you may know, the Hagia Sophia is one of the oldest churches in the world. It was converted to a mosque by the conqueror of Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed, the first, the second. And with the Turkish secular state, it became a museum, so it's not to defend either religion. My vision or my fantasy is that it would become a temple for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And it wouldn't be a place where we pray in the same way, because I agree with Rabbi that there is a very distinct way of prayer within Islam, Judaism, within Christianity. But rather, there would be different corners of that common temple in which we can pray in our own distinct way, and that would be a statement to the world that we can coexist in very close proximity in a very holy space and not have to be in conflict or in competition over such a space.
This is for our Jewish and Christian presenters. You both alluded to the referenced enemies. Would you speak to when a person moves from being a neighbor to being an enemy, And what, besides prayer, is acceptable when engaging the enemy?
Maybe you can set up a kind of neighbor-enemy scale with, oh, we're up to 52%, you know, on the, no. We all know that some of our neighbors are difficult, but that doesn't mean that they're enemies. I think that we need to be very careful in using that term enemy. Now, there may be people who are physically attacking us. Okay, that person is an enemy. Okay, in that case, what do you do? Well, certainly prayer is something that you do. Christians do take prayer very seriously, and that prayer on behalf of someone is one of the most important, good works that one can do on behalf of that person. But perhaps there are other things. Perhaps you can, can you contribute to that person's conversion? I mean, this was the story that I told in my talk, the story of Saul who became Paul, who was actually converted from being an enemy of the early Christian church to being its great missionary. Now, what happens there? How does that conversion take place? Certainly, that is an act of love for that enemy. Rabbi Balinsky, help me.
I think the distinction, I think you're right. I think there's a distinction between the enemy who wants to make war against you and kill you. We're talking about a combat mortal enemy. There's certainly no command within the context of Jewish tradition and Judaism not to fight back. But if we move to another area of enemy, where it's, I guess, a person you're in opposition to, but it's not mortal fear of death enemy. There's actually an interesting rabbinic discussion, of course. Twice, but once in Exodus and Deuteronomy, there's a discussion about encountering someone's ox along the way. And there's two encounters with the ox. In one case, someone is loading an ox that's sort of on the ground in an okay way and being loaded with various things that the ox is to carry. And the second case is an ox that is struggling under its load. It's already loaded, but it's struggling under. Okay? Now, in both cases, whether it's your friend's ox or your enemy's ox, you have to help the ox. Okay? Either loading it or if it's teetering. Okay? And you have these verses both in Exodus and Deuteronomy discussing this ox. Now, then you get the rabbis come, and of course they see it and have to ask a question. When you're loading an ox, the ox isn't suffering. It's just being loaded, but it needs help to get up, to carry the burdens. When an ox is teetering under its load, then it needs assistance, okay? Because it's teetering under load, you don't want it to collapse. From the point of view of the ox, which ox should you help first? What do you think? The teetering ox. Okay, so here comes the great, I love this rabbinic. Yeah. You come and you see two oxes. One is teetering under its load, and one needs help getting loaded up. The ox that's teetering under its load is your friend's ox. The one that needs help getting up is your enemy's ox. You got that? Now, from the point of view of the ox, which ox should you help first? The teetering ox. However, the rabbis say from the point of view of the human relationship, you should help your enemy's ox first. Because in helping your enemy's ox, you will appease his negative qualities and potentially transform that person into your friend. Okay, you got that? And it depends which vantage point you're dealing with. Eventually you help both oxes, but it depends which vantage point you're dealing with. Now, what I see taking place there is, by the way, I had a teacher who took this really seriously and would stop and assist people if they were changing their tires along the highway, and seeing that as a parallel to the ox problem. He then founded AAA and made a fortune. No, no, but it is true. He really took that seriously. He really took that seriously, which is a fascinating application. Now, what does this mean? It means that there's an awareness of, I'll stop. It means that there's an awareness of a mortal enemy that you don't worry about oxes, you worry about saving your life. But someone with whom you have a conflict, and that type of enemy, someone with whom you have a conflict, say, within either your own community or the broader society, then whatever you can do to appease that anger that the enemy has and move it to a potential bond of friendship is what you really should be doing and try to do. And that becomes sort of the way to go. But still with the recognition, sometimes people are out to kill you. The moral action there is to kill them first.
Okay. Here's a question for Ahmed. You stated you send out press releases supporting moderation and condemning terrorism. Don't they, the media or printer, and print or relay these press releases to other outlets?
They do. I think we've found a good degree of success as CARE, getting our voice into the media. But if you look at the larger picture, you're talking about 300 million people, and you're talking about 1.5 million Muslims, according to the Pew poll. We thought we were 7 million, apparently we're a lot less than that. And you have a handful of organizations that are trying to get the word across on behalf of Muslims at large to the rest of the American population. So it's an uphill battle. And even if you were to get quoted, be in a paper or two or on a news outlet or two, but it wouldn't be at the same level of omnipresence that unfortunately, a bomb being, going off somewhere in the world is going to get all across the media.
Well, that's the end of the questions for now. Questions will be in your head as you go home. Questions will be in your conversations with others as you talk with them about what you've heard and listened to today. And think about those questions. Try to find the answers for them if you don't have them. There's references throughout our world that you can go to. And I really appreciate your attention today to these questions.
Thank you all for coming, but I'm going to introduce the Jewish co-chair. Her name is Julia Z, and she will have closing remarks for all of us.
Can you hear me with this?
Yeah.
Yeah. We want to thank all for coming this afternoon. We especially want to thank St. Michael Church for our hosts. Thank you so much. This has been just wonderful. Just to see how this room was set up, for me, it just was wonderful. We also want to give our thanks to the speakers today. Ahmed, Rehab. Thank you. Rabbi Michael Balinsky. And Professor Mark Swanson. Thank you. Okay.
I have to give it to Betty. Come on, Betty.
Betty, our wonderful moderator. Betty is a member of this wonderful church, St. Michael Catholic Church. We want to also give our appreciation to this church and to Betty for just being our manager today. Thank you, Betty. Thank you all. I would like to leave you with this thought. When justice lives within us, when love evokes a willing sacrifice from us, when to the last full measure of selfless devotion, we demonstrate our belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, then goodness will enter our lives, and we then begin to change the world. Peace to everyone. Thank you for being here.